Welcome to People More Interesting Than Me, the podcast, where I step back and let fascinating individuals take the spotlight. Join me as I sit down with incredible guests who captivate and inspire, showcasing their stories, experiences, and wisdom that make them truly extraordinary. Tune in for engaging conversations that'll leave you enlightened and entertained. At least I'm entertained. This week's guest brings a deep sense of meaning, memory, and connection to his craft. Zak Foster is a renowned textile expert, known for his breathtakingly beautiful and deeply personal quilts. What makes Zak's work stand out isn't just the intricate designs or the vibrant colors, it's the stories each quilt tells. Drawing inspiration from the past, Zak often uses repurposed materials, imbuing his creations with a sense of history and soul. Whether he's crafting memory quilts that celebrate the lives of loved ones or exploring the intersection of art and spirituality, Zak's work speaks to the heart. In this episode, we'll delve into his creative journey, the emotional impact of his art, and how he brings stories to life through the fabric of his quilts. Enjoy. Today I have Zak with me. Today, Zak Foster. The one thing I wanted to note, which is a fun fact, is that you have a fantastic mustache. I feel like the mustache is like in a constant battle, like throughout like the centuries, because then you have like really like they're warriors. Like you've got the negatives, like Mussolini or what's another battle? Just like
Hitler.
Yeah, I was gonna say Hitler,
that little tiny
but like that's it's just, like. But then you've got like the good warriors, like Magnum. What's his name?
Burt Reynolds.
Burt Reynolds.
My God, legend.
What's the guy from Magnum PI? I don't remember his name, but he had a mustache and he looks amazing, and that I don't know. I just want to say you have an amazing mustache, and it looks like you take good care of it. But
I do. Thank you very much. Yeah, my grandma loves it. When I go visit her in the nursing home, every time I walk in, she's like, "I like your mustache," and I don't even like mustaches. So, thanks, grandma.
See, that's the best thing when you get someone over that hump of like not liking mustaches, that they like the mustache. That's perfect.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So, I obviously pulled you in today because I was doing research on obviously more people interesting in me, and obviously you popped up. And I was looking for someone heavy in I would say textile industry that I've looked for cooks and all these other people, kind of like they make the common thing extraordinary. And that's what I kind of saw from your videos, what you've dived into, and even what you're trying to do with your podcast. I thought it was, like fascinating. You could probably talk forever on the aspects of, I'm going to say incorrect stuff, but like thread or even hand sewing or elaborating on that. How did it get to this point where you were able to make something so, like hand stitching so amazing? Like, how did you get to this point?
Michael, I'm a sucker. I'm an absolute sucker. There's something about textiles that they hold their own stories and their own history and their own memories. And I just keep finding new fabrics with new stories that I want to like tease out and work with. So I don't know. I blame it on the textiles. I really do. I made my first quilt. Well, technically, I made my first quilt in the third grade. In the early 90s, we were having Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House on the Prairie Day, and I made my first 4-square patch. But then I took some time off, and I made my first official quilt for a friend of mine who was having their first kid, and it was a very humble affair. But before I even finished that quilt, I had an idea for a second one, and then a third one, a fourth one. The rest is history. I've made over 200 quilts now, probably. And I think when I made my first quilt that I had expected that it would just be like a quick summer fling, like I am a creative magpie in many ways, or at least up until the time I discovered fabric. I went from one thing to the next, drawing to painting to screen printing to sculpture. But there was something when I made that quilt that I felt like I was tapping into an incredibly long tradition. And hand sewing specifically, like as I am pulling that thread through the layers of fabric, and there's this very subtle vibration that runs the length of your forearm when you do that. And I just couldn't help but think of all of my foremothers and some forefathers too, but mostly foremothers, let's be honest. I just couldn't help but think of all of my foremothers who sensed that same pulse running through their body and that I was connected with that tradition. So I'm hooked. There's no turning back now.
Yeah, the way you describe it, it just sounds like blood pulsing through a body. It's like giving life to, like something that's dead before. I've never thought of like thread doing that to textile.
When you think of the role of fabric in our lives, it is one of the materials that humans are closest to. In that, like I've heard fabric described as our second skin because we do spend so much of our time clothed in fabric. I've heard it described as our first roof, right? It's that first thing that separates us from the outside world. And so we have a really intimate relationship with it. More so, you could argue, than any other material, wood, glass, metal, etc. Right? Everyone has something to say about fabric, even if it's just, this is what I put on this morning. Here's why. And because of that common experience that we all have with it, there's some really powerful potential for human connection and storytelling that I think can happen in any artistic medium, but is especially easy to tap into with textiles.
Okay. And this might be a horrible question or a great question, but
I'm here for it.
what is your opinion on, I've seen stuff on frequencies, comparing like something as like Under Armour material to wool to just plain cotton, having, like something like resonant frequencies or different frequencies to your body that causes issues. To me, it sounds like something similar to, I don't know, fluoride in the toothpaste or stuff like that. Do you have any opinion on that, or?
Well, I have a general felt sense about it, in that life is too short not to be comfortable. You should feel good in the clothes that you wear. You should feel good in the bedding that you wrap up in at night. And if something about that fiber isn't feeling good to you, then don't worry about it. Move on to the next one. And for me, it's generally a natural versus synthetic divide. Most synthetics on my body feel hot and sweaty, so I choose not to wear them. But that said, there's also wool, which is a natural fiber, which can often be scratchy. So for me, it's how do I want to feel in my clothes, which is just a short step away from how do I want to feel in my body. And the answer is the same to both, which is perfectly at home. So here I am.
No, that's great. Yeah, it's just it's like one of those things that just you're going through social media and you just add to the pile of like, well, this could possibly kill me, but like if, it's going to make me uncomfortable mentally, physically, or long term. So I just thought,
and that's what I can speak to. But it's also, there also does seem to me to be a certain amount of probability that the chemicals that we hold so close to our skin do have some kind of an impact. I mean, we are walking systems. We are sacks of chemicals as human beings. We don't exist independently of the environment. So what we choose to surround ourselves with and come in contact with has to have some kind of an effect. I'm not a scientist, so I can't tell you what that is, but I can see the room for that happening.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just one of those things, you'll figure out down the line, like 20 or 30 years. Like I imagine plastics might be like that, where people are like, oh, by the way, all these plastics that we were using, they're not entirely good for us, but
that's right.
What I was going to say is how do you start to get into like making your quilts? Obviously, I would imagine it's a strenuous process because I myself have done a small amount of that. And, like obviously
You've
getting
done some
over
quilting?
on a very small level, just like
I'm
you did
so
in third
impressed.
grade.
Okay.
No, I'm saying on a very, very small level.
Listen,
I think
that's
it
more
was
than a lot of people,
Boy
Michael.
Scouts, but
Yeah.
uh, obviously you have to get over, the needle. I mean, you've probably experienced enough blood in your day to understand those small details. But what goes like into your projects? Obviously, um, do you get commissioned? Do you how does that work?
Well, I'll say that at this point in the journey, I'm fortunate enough to be able to pass commissions on to other artists who are looking for commissions. I one of the many hats that I wear, besides hosting another podcast called Seam Side, where we explore the inner work of textiles. Another thing that I do is I call myself the official cheerleader of the Quilty Nook. The Quilty Nook is a community for online textile artists who love all things textiles, but our common denominator is quilts, And so their support financially, because you have to pay like a small $9 fee to be a member of the Nook, their financial support allows me to make exactly the work I want to make without worrying about will this sell? Like what there for me, there are zero market influences on the work that I make. And I know that not every artist can say that. So I feel truly, truly grateful for that. Which means how do I get started with a quilt? I would say there's kind of two pathways, but they all start with listening and being responsive, right? I don't see my role as the artist as someone who tries to forge something brand new that's never existed in the world. I'm not trying to force anything. What I do is I listen either to that small, still voice inside of me that says, this could be helpful for whatever's happening in the world, or I'm listening to the fabric in my hand and I'm thinking about what would make it shine the most, stand out the most, be the best version of itself that it can be. How can I use that fabric to engage people in conversation? How can I use its softness, its texture, its color to draw people into conversation? And so, in that sense, I think it's a relationship, right? Either to this thing in my hands or the still small voice within, but it doesn't seem like it starts with me. It just feels like I'm just kind of this. I work as an artist on increasing my sensitivity as an antenna for the universe. And then I go from there.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds a lot like, I mean, the common idiom with was it Da Vinci? I'm trying to think. I think it's Da Vinci when he did David. He wouldn't when he looked at the slab of marble, it wasn't that he was creating something. He was bringing it out of the marble. Um,
Yeah, all
and
you got to do is just cut away everything that's not David. That's all
exactly.
you got to do. Piece of cake.
Yeah, scissors and but and the other thing I'm thinking of is third grade you who was just like thinking on to the next one, like, oh, I'll do this one. And then after I'm done that, that's in the back of my head, like I'll kind of hit that. Um, I would imagine just you having a huge, how many rooms do you just have filled with fabric? I imagine you started with one room and then, you know, you've
Yeah.
you've got a swath of fabrics everywhere. Is that kind of what it looks like?
Yeah. I would advise anyone who's thinking about going into textiles to consider consulting with their roommate or live-in partner first because it is a very bulky affair. It's not like, you know, painters, sure, they get canvases that accumulate over time, but they just have little tubes of paint for the most part, right? Quilters have tons of fabric. I mean, we're pretty notorious for our stashes. I try to keep things pretty light. I currently live in Brooklyn, although that's changing in the next month. I'll be moving down to Tennessee. And in Brooklyn, I work out of the Eden portion of our Eden kitchen. So it's like this, like maybe 8 by 10 feet space. Most of that, of course, is taken up with tabletop and shelving. But just like the goldfish that responds to the size of the pond by growing smaller or by growing bigger or staying smaller, I think the size of my workspace guides what I do. And what that's meant for the last several years is that I tend to make smaller handheld pieces, like maybe a yard by a yard, maybe 5 feet by 5 feet, somewhere in that range. Because that's just what I can manage, right? Trying to create a king size quilt, which I have done in that space, is a behemoth. I mean, that's to, we don't, if you're not a quilter, you might not understand how big a king size quilt actually is. If you have one in your home, take it off your bed, lay it out on your floor, and it's huge because you have to have the additional feet that drape off the side, right? So, a smaller space has kept me working small, which actually has been great because it allows me to do a lot of hand detailing and things that add nuance and layers and I think make my work so compelling from a distance, but then also as you get up close and you can study those details.
No, that sounds great. And I didn't even think about that, especially being in an apartment. I mean, to have even it's probably unheard of if, well, it's not unheard of to have a king size bed in an apartment, but still, usually when you have a king size bed in an apartment, it's kind of like taking up 2/3 of the room. I can't even
None of my
imagine.
friends have king size beds in Brooklyn. No, none of my friends.
There you go. That's funny. But what spurred the movement to Nashville?
Well, my partner got a job. And so it's the same thing that took me to New York City back in 2008, turns out love. It's like, so what am I going to do? The choices are A or B, and one of those options doesn't have my sweetheart in it. So
But
it's
that's
an
the
easy
best thing, though.
decision.
You can get more space, correct? I would
That's
imagine
right.
more
That's right.
space.
That's right. No, we're going to get a house, and that feels very good right now.
There you go. And I would imagine quilting is even bigger in Nashville than it is in.
Yeah,
So that's
no
great.
doubt. Well, that's the funny thing, Michael, is I didn't start quilting until after I'd been in New York for a couple years. And so I've always just kind of wondered. It's a question I live with, to employ the phrase from Rilke. It's a question I live with, that was quilting for me a way of channeling home, and trying to bring that a little bit closer. I don't know, but it sounds like a nice theory, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely does. Because I mean, just like we're talking about textiles, is it it's one of those basis of everything. Like you said, it's a second skin. It's your first roof. It's something that you can kind of take on and not just on, like a warmth level. There's so many layers to it, which, like you don't think about because you see it every day. It's kind of like desensitized you. Uh,
Absolutely.
but what I'm trying to get at is what do you feel, or when do you really feel that your quilt is finished for a project? Like, is it when, because I would imagine you can keep on going, just like a painting or, like we were talking about sculpture. How do you know it's finished? And obviously, it's great that you kind of have artistic. I think that's what every artist is looking for. It's kind of like a trust fall, basically. You don't really need to, like, this isn't going towards something. It's more like you're letting you're letting your dog out with no leash, no fence. They can really do whatever they want. Get the zoomies, climb up the tree to get the squirrel, try to catch the squirrel. How do you know a piece is done when you have such um, artistic license, we'll say?
Oh, that's a beautiful question, Michael. And I think if I had a good answer, I would just spit it out. But I don't know. I kind of think that, like us humans, maybe the objects we create are perpetual works in progress. And especially the way that I work, which tends to be a lot of applique. And for listeners who aren't familiar with the sewy jargon, applique is just sewing a piece of fabric down on top of another piece of fabric. So it's really easy. It's a very additive process. And so I'll often find that I'll revisit a quilt months after I thought it was quote unquote finished. I'm like, nope. And I'll just stitch a little something extra on it. So who knows? I mean, I can tell you that there's definitely a point where a quilt gets bound and that, putting the edging around, that feels finished a lot of times. There's a point where I feel ready to share it with the world. That feels like a degree of finish. I don't know if quilts or us are ever really finished.
That's good. That's it. That's a very good way to phrase that, because I'm just thinking like books. Like some people, you pick up one book 5 years ago and you look at it and you're like, this is not for me. And then you're a completely different person than you were 5 years ago. You pick it up and the book kind of really resonates with you. So I can definitely see that with quilting. And like I said, layers. There's just some things you can add to it that you weren't feeling then. Man.
When I think for the flip side of the book, for the author, because my partner's a writer, it's even worse, right? Like you can constantly move language around in a way that visually my things get pretty tacked down. Like I'll rip out stitches. I don't care. But for the most part, that would be a lot of labor. And so I don't do it unless I really feel the need for it. But moving words around on a screen or a page is so easy that it's like infinitely tweakable. So yeah, let's get a writer on here. Let's talk about when is a book finished? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Taking away is a lot more difficult with quilting than it is, especially if it's a layer on the bottom. De-stitching. That's the worst. Because you don't see holes in the letters.
Nope.
Do you have any memorable stories where your quilting has really affected kind of recipients or even people viewing them?
Well, I'll tell you this one, Michael. I mean, I got a lot I could tell you, but I'll tell you this one. About 3 years ago, a woman named Claire in Brooklyn reached out to me, asking me to make a memory quilt for her husband, Teddy, that was turning 40 pretty soon. And so she conspired behind his back with all of his family to send me fabrics. I was getting all these packages in the mail. And they had little notes attached to them. This belonged to so-and-so. This belonged to so-and-so. And I was working that to a quilt. And as I was working it, I'd send Claire pictures. We'd text back and forth. And I knew the entire time that we were working on this project together that Claire also was dealing with a cancer diagnosis of her own. And she was getting treatment for it. I also knew they'd been recently married. So some of the material that I got was, cloth napkins that they'd used at their wedding and things like that. Well, I get the quilt top done and I send a picture of it to Claire one night and I didn't hear back right away, which is unusual for her. She was pretty quick on it, And it was a few hours later when I got a text back saying, Zach, that's more beautiful than I could ever pictured. But I'm in the hospital right now and I'm not feeling so good. Could you please tell Teddy about this quilt? He had no idea. Keep in mind, Teddy had no idea. I've never talked to Teddy. She said, can you please tell Teddy about his quilt? Because tomorrow's his birthday. And how am I going to tell Claire no? So I get Teddy's number. I reach out to him. And I don't hear back. And the reason I don't hear back is because just about a day later, Claire passes away. And for me, as the artist working on that quilt, it was more of a gut punch than I would have expected. Hearing news about someone that I'd only briefly met in real life and texted with a few times. But I do think there's something really compelling about working with someone's well-loved clothing and other textile objects in their lives. So I do feel like there's a closeness that we had somehow been knit together through that process. And it became, in the wake of Claire's passing, even more imperative for me to get that quilt finished and get it to Teddy so that he could have that not only as a commemoration of 4 decades on this planet, but also the presence that his wife wants occupied in his life. So I get it done. I text him again, and I don't hear back from Teddy. I give him a few days. And eventually I reach out to his mom because I also had her contact information. She had mailed me some of that fabric after all. And she says, yeah, let's just give him a little time. Let's see how this goes. I was like, no problem. I'll hold on to it. I often see myself as a container for not only fabric, but stories about people's lives and strong emotions that go along with those textiles, right? Our quilts contain multitudes. And so I was like, no problem. I can hold on to this quilt until Teddy's ready. Fast forward a year, still have this quilt. And at that point, I was getting ready to move. So I reached back out to Teddy's mom, telling her the situation. She says she talked to her son, figure out where things stood. Turns out Teddy was ready for the quilt. Good. We set a date. He's going to come over one evening, and I was going to hand him the quilt. In a turn of events that can only happen in the movie theater, the night that Teddy was supposed to come over, it was a dark and stormy night. Like, it was raining cats and dogs. It was terrible. Like, it's the kind of weather if you didn't have to go out in, you wouldn't go out in. But Teddy and I had a plan. He was coming over. He showed up at my apartment building, soaking wet. And when he walked through those doors, I had never met this person before in my life. But we just hugged each other and cried, which it sounds a little silly maybe, but I think the thing that keeps me working with textiles is that it is the connective tissue. It can be the connective tissue between us. And so I laid the quilt after we get done hugging and crying. I laid the quilt out in the lobby for him to get a better look at it. And I'm pointing out the materials that Claire and her family had given me. And I said, he recognized some of them, of course. He's like, oh, those are Claire's pajamas. And he recognized his dad's seersucker suits and his grandfather's Piggly Wiggly apron. And he knew so much of it. And there's others that he didn't know. So I was very happy to pass along those stories to him. And he left with that quilt tucked up back under his arm, back out into that dark and rainy night. And I just thought, my God, the power of these textiles to hold memories, to hold stories, to hold space in a way that doesn't feel empty and it doesn't feel like a void. It just holds it. And I just think that's beautiful. That's what keeps me coming back to working with fabric.
No, that's a really good story. That is, what is that author, Nora, it's not Nora Roberts, Sparks, who did all the popular movies in like the 2016.
Oh, yeah.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Oh,
it's really sweet. It was really sweet.
That is like your Sistine then. Like, so, like thinking about that, that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So moving forward with, like obviously having your own artistic license, is there anything that you kind of not are trying to reach, but because you just move on to the next quilt, next quilt, next quilt, but is there anything you're trying to expand on besides, more and more quilts? Anything that you're trying to, I don't know, expand out to?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to make a brand new world, one that actually works for all 8 billion of us. I'm trying to do that. In the meantime, I have two big bodies of work that are ongoing series. One is called Southern White Amnesia, and one is called The New Apocalypse. And so I can go into both of those briefly if you would like to hear about them.
Yeah.
So Southern White Amnesia was born. I'm the family historian in my family, and I grew up in the South. I'm in North Carolina. I am white, and my family has been in the South for generations, which statistically means my ancestors engaged in slavery, right? Well, I never heard anything about that growing up. But as I was doing different family history research, some records started to surface. And I went and asked somebody in my family about it, somebody who should know. And I said, is it true? Is this what these records are saying, that our ancestors owned slaves? And they said, No, like real fast. They said, no, of course not. And then after a pause, I think we would know. That was my light bulb moment. I was like, wait a second. I think we would know. How many other white Southern folks, and not even Southern, how many other white folks are walking around the world just assuming that they would know that some of their wealth and privilege had derived from the exploitation of black labor in the past. And so that sparked a whole new body of work for me, Southern white amnesia. Because if you were to, I call it amnesia because if you were to go back not even 100 years, if you were to go back 85 years or so in my family, there were still people alive who would have heard firsthand stories about slavery and my family's connection with it. Yet, in those intervening 85 years, those stories mysteriously dissipate. We don't want to talk about it. And I understand why we don't want to talk about it. White folks don't want to talk about it most times. And a lot of times black folks don't want to talk about it. Well, especially after I've read a lot of it was during the WPA that they went and collected a bunch of stories, right, from the formerly enslaved. And there are a lot of folks that said, a lot of black folks said, you know, I don't want to pass that down to my children. We just don't talk about it. And I get that instinct. I get that inclination. And so here we have this thing that everybody would just rather forget. The only problem with it is that it's all right in front of us all the time. We are still in this country living with choices that were made decades and centuries ago. And I don't think we can loose ourselves of those echoing consequences until we get at the root. And so this work is trying to get at the root. And I'm trying to walk this really thin line here between well, I'll tell you when I first discovered the line I'm trying to walk. I was at the International Quilt Museum in November 2020 something. And Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi, who's a big time, arguably the nation's leading scholar, collector, expert on African American makers and their quilts. And she had this big show at the International Quilt Museum. I got to meet her that night. We walked around looking at her quilts. We went out to dinner afterwards. I was fanboying all over the place. But what stood out to me that night, looking at the quilts made by so many different black artists, is that they were making deeply personal quilts oftentimes. But these personal quilts, these personal stories, almost always tied back to much larger historical and societal themes, right? And until that point in my thinking, when I think of like social justice quilts, the quilts that would come to my mind, the kinds of quilts that I had seen a lot of, were more like slogans and memes that had been converted into textiles. And those quilts have their place, but I was looking to do something a little bit differently. I was looking to tell a more nuanced story. And so the quilts in Southern white amnesia are all based in my family's experience with slavery. And one of the things I like about that is we may disagree that the slavery of 100 years ago continues to have an effect on today's society. We may not agree on that point. But you know what we can't disagree on is what my family went through and how my family has passed down wealth through the generations. One of my quilts is called Silver Dollar because in the top right corner, I sewed an actual silver dollar down on that quilt that my grandfather gave me. And it says in big pink letters, my grandfather gave me this silver dollar. And then the rest of the quilt is a genealogical chart. Most of us are familiar with the family tree, but there's another form, a lot older, called the family fan. And what I like about this layout is it makes it really easy to trace the various branches to one root. And you can see incredibly clearly that the branches of my family where people were engaged in the exploitation of black labor in founding this country are the same branches of the family that had access to higher education for generations. And you can see those trends continuing into the modern day and leading very uncomfortably to me in 2024. I graduated from college. Even got a master's degree after that, right? And so in many ways, I am just one link in a chain, a long chain that has benefited from the things my ancestors did in the past. And so what does that mean? It means a lot of things, but that's what I'm exploring with the quilts. That's Southern white amnesia, trying to say just because you don't remember it or I don't remember it doesn't mean it didn't happen and doesn't mean it's not impacting so much of what we see happening in the world around us today. Southern amnesia is a historically oriented body of work that also has an eye on the present. It's one eye on the past and one eye on the present. The other body of work, though, that I find really compelling is called the New Apocalypse. And that has one eye on the present and one eye on the future. I had a moment about 6 months or so ago. It wasn't that long ago, Michael. I was talking with somebody who wanted me to contribute a piece for a show, an exhibition, but it wasn't for another 18 months into 2025, it was. And my knee jerk reaction was, you're cute. You think we're going to be here in 2025. That was my honest reaction. And when I observed that in myself, that I don't see the near future being a place where there might be space for exhibitions of art. When I noticed that myself, I wondered how widespread that was, how much other people are feeling it. Turns out it's incredibly widespread. I probably don't need to tell you or anyone listening that a lot of us have questions about the stability of the future. And so the New Apocalypse collection is seeking to rejigger our imaginations and our thinking about the future, looking for ways in which the future can very plausibly be a positive place to exist. I'm not looking for like pie in the sky, like reaching for something here. There are some really concrete ways in which the future is looking brighter. We are more interconnected today than ever before, and there's no reason why that should take a negative turn rather than a positive turn. For example, right? More and more, we understand that we have an outsized impact on the environment around us, more so than any generation previous. And so we know we have to curtail some of the ways in which we move through this world. So I see a lot of reasons for hope, and I absolutely understand the anxiety. I live with the anxiety, but I'm interested more in fortifying the people who see these works and who are interested in working together to make that world possible. And I believe it is possible. You know, I think about how many times have I looked down on the floor of my studio and I see this inert little scrap of fabric just laying there. Maybe it's been there for a while. Maybe it's dusty. And I pick it up and it's just the thing that quilt needs. Similarly, in this world, answers are all around us. We may or may not be tapping into them yet, but they're there. And it just takes somebody picking them up, dusting them off, and getting to work. So I'm doing that. A lot of people are doing that. And I think it's the only way we're going to get there. But I choose to be optimistic. I choose to be hopeful.
That's good. I think we can only really extend past where we're at now by seeing, like past it. I don't think you can kind of really go past not just your means, but your ability if you don't actually set your standards higher. Not even your standards, but your view, your dreams, what you see yourself to become. Because, if you are just like monotonous, where you do the same thing every day and I watch Netflix, but like you watch Netflix, then you go to bed. You don't really even break out of the mold. Like, how do you expect yourself to be better? And not even better, just a good person, like to yourself first. And then that's when you can kind of help the world, help everyone else. So yeah. Quick question on your white amnesia project. Obviously you're in North Carolina. Are you getting full support from your family when you're looking all this up? Obviously no one is, just like you said, it's been like 85 years, but your family's fine with everything like that?
Yeah. Although I'm also going to say that the Southern Amnesia project is one part textiles and one part family engineering, right? In a sense that sometimes I have this idea that maybe I'm making all these quilts just to be able to talk to my family about what I've discovered in the records. It just seems like let's create this neutral object that we can talk about complicated and complex things without it feeling defensive, right? I don't want anybody to feel like they have to defend something. I don't think that'll get us anywhere. But let's just explore this question together. And so, one of the things I've been doing alongside um, making the quilts is this kind of private track of the project, which is really intentionally cultivating better relationships with the side of my family that did engage in slavery in the past and reaching out to them because we've kind of scattered to the four winds in recent years, and so without someone doing the work of kin keeping and keeping us together, we're not going to have these conversations. So another one of the hats that I wear in this family is keeping folks together, or at least trying to. And so over the last couple of years, since the beginning of Southern White Amnesia, I've also been trying to find ways to reestablish the connections I had with them when I was younger, with my aunts and my uncles and extended family, so that we can talk about these things more openly. And I would like to work in a direction where I see this culminating project that's still kind of nebulous in my mind. But in my research, I have run across the presence of over 400 enslaved Black people in my family history. And what I would like to do is create some kind of a piece, probably a quilt, that is a memorial placeholder for these over 400 folks, and would stitch in there whatever we know about them. And usually all that we knew about that person, because of the way white folks kept records back then, was their age, their gender, and whether they were Black, white, or mulatto, to use the term of the day. But sometimes we knew more. Sometimes we knew their name, Evie or Sarah or Jane or Adam or Spencer. And if we know that, that's going to go on the quilt. If we knew like occupation or trade or special skills they had, that would go in the quilt. And to gather the material for that memorial quilt, I would like that to come from my family by invitation. I would like to share with them the records that I've found, that I've seen, that have been so, I want to say enlightening, but that doesn't feel right. It has revealed to me so much about our family's past. I want to share those records with them and then ask them to contribute a piece of cloth from their own closet that would become part of this quilt as a way of acknowledging that they have looked at these records and they now know our shared history as a family. And what I think is, I try to take a page out of Brian Stevenson's book here, right? He had a large role. He helped found I'm going to get the name wrong, National Center for Justice down in Alabama, where there's a pavilion outside of the museum for every county where Black folk was lynched has a column suspended from the roof of this pavilion. Outside of the pavilion, in this little courtyard, the suspended columns have a sibling column just like it. And the counties that have their names engraved on those columns are invited to take them back home to their county under the condition that they display them publicly. They can't hide them away. And what I love about what Brian Stevenson has done here, so genius, is that it's win-win either way. He has set up the perfect mechanism here, because if the county chooses not to take their column home with them, well, everyone that comes to the museum sees that they're not reckoning with their history. If the county does, of course, choose to take their column home, well, then everybody back home gets to learn more about where they came from. So similarly, I could see in this project there being room for, if you donate fabric, wonderful. Thank you very much. It'll go in the quilt. If you don't, no problem. I'll substitute, who knows what, like a solid piece of white fabric.
Something generic.
Something super generic.
John Doe type.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. So that you could also see it's not just a memorial placeholder for those 400 lives who will forever be intertwined with my family's history. It's not just a memorial for them, but it's also a snapshot of where we are as a family and where we are as a larger culture in relating to our own personal connection in these modern times to our own history. So there's a lot there, and it's still taking shape in my mind. But for that project to happen, I want to have really good, healthy, intact relationships with my extended family. I don't want to be, oh, there goes liberal Zach from Brooklyn hitting us up for some, like I'm just not
Yeah.
interested in, I don't want to have that kind of air about it. And as much as I have control over that.
No, that sounds great because the way you're describing it, I don't even think of it even as like a physical, like tangible thing. Because when I hear it, it's kind of like, like a packed thing that's kind of like it's gonna sound stupid, but like a peace treaty. Like not even a something like that. It's kind of like mending, not just mending fences, but kind of like putting it out there, trying to not not mend fences, but kind of heal and understand. And just like you said, a lot of people are like, "Oh, we would know." You know what I mean? Like, yeah, but let's like understand. Let's not just like bury it. But
It
yeah,
starts with acknowledging, and then we can talk about mending and healing, which often takes a form of reparations. Um, oh man, there's something important I was going to say about acknowledging. It left me.
okay. I have those
We'll
moments
circle
all the
back to it if
time.
it comes up. Yeah. I just get so excited about this stuff. I can't help it.
Yeah, no problem. Is there, I'm about to do the closing question. Is there anything else you wanted to add in? Anything you wanted to promote that you're working on besides these two projects?
Well, yeah. So another labor of love that I've been engaged with the last few months, handful of months, is I'm I'm a writer now. I have a book coming out. It's called The World Needs Your Next Quilt. And that goes back to the fact that I am the official cheerleader of all quilters everywhere. Grandiose title. And I truly believe that each of us has like this special constellation of talents and lived experiences and ways of working with materials that the world needs, right? What the world does not need is more mass-produced stuff. What the world does need is more individuals sharing their authentic stories and lived experiences. And I can help people do that through textile. So I've written this book called The World Needs Your Next Quilt that takes us through step by step. It's this framework about that breaks the quilt making process down into stages, right? Picking your colors, picking your fabrics, picking your mode of assembly, how are you going to bind it, all of that stuff. And we take each stage and we connect it back to the story we're trying to tell with the fabric. And we ask ourselves, how can I use this particular stage of quilt making to reinforce my narrative? And we do that over and over and over for each stage so that by the end of that process, you have a highly nuanced, powerful storytelling quilt. I haven't seen anything out there quite like it. And what's exciting to me, and I almost wrote this in the afterword or whatever they're called, epilogue, is that this is a framework that no matter what no matter what your passion is, we can think about this. Like maybe you love preparing meals for your family, right? Well, then how can you use the ingredients to say something about why you love to make meals for your family? How can you use the way you set the table to tell that? How can you use all these different elements that go into meal planning or sculpture making or event planning or like whatever your thing is? How can we use every single facet of that jewel to say one more time our truth? And so that's happening. And so my friend down in Knoxville, Tennessee, shout out to Alicia Mann, she's running a print shop and she is printing this up hand by hand on the Rizzo machine. All the little hipster kids out there like, yeah, Rizzo, I know. And the covers are going to be letterpress. It is gorgeous. Now, unfortunately, the first run sold out in less than a week on pre-order, but there is a wait list, and I can give you that link if folks are interested and they want to
No,
get on
that's
it because
awesome.
there
I'll
will
drop
most
it with the episode. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, there will most definitely be a second press, including some European distribution and hopefully Australian distribution as well.
That's awesome. And by hand, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, that
Although I was talking with her last night, she's like, yeah, the number, I mean, she's making hundreds of copies of this book. And she's like, yeah, this is pushing what's humanly possible for one person. So I
but
was like, we have to recalibrate for the second run. We'll figure it out.
the cool thing is it fits with your vibe though. That's the problem.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It really is. And I mean, speaking of fitting with the vibe, is like the pages are printed in this beautiful teal ink. Well, a third of the way in, the teal ink ran out. And so she had to replace it. And what we didn't know is that between buying the first cartridge and the second cartridge, they changed their ink formula a little bit. So the teal is a little bluer rather than green. But it's amazing to see the two colors together. And I'm like, that's just how my quilts are. Like I'm using stuff that's faded in some spots and brighter in other spots. Like it's perfect.
I have a company that uses fabric, and we've had that issue as well. Like you're getting the same fabric, and some 9 out of 10 times, if you don't have the two to compare, you wouldn't really be able to pick it out. But when you have them next to each other, you're like, those are different colors.
Well, the cool thing is the way Alicia has been printing the pages is the lighter ones are going to be interspersed kind of randomly throughout all the darker ones. So it's just going to be this cool like tone on tone book. At least the first printing. We'll see what happens the second run.
Okay, we're on our last question. Are you ready?
Totally.
What is something that your parents did that you like to pass on to the next generation? And what is something new that you'd like to try?
Okay, I'm gonna cheat and give you two for the first one because the second one just came to mind. One, when I was a kid, my mom had giant manila envelopes or like portfolio envelopes. Like imagine they're probably like 3 feet by 4 feet or something, which was humongous to a toddler. Every piece of art me and my brothers would bring home, she would put in that folder. She would file it away. And the implicit understanding that I don't even know if I could have verbalized it as a kid, but I can definitely verbalize it now as an adult, is that what we make matters. This is what my mom taught me by doing that. She didn't have to say anything, but just by keeping it, she taught me what we make matters. And that's something I deeply believe today. Second thing is that my grandmother, my mom's mom, just passed almost just a year and a few days ago at the ripe old age of 107. She led an incredible life. She moved into my childhood home where we're sitting and talking right now and got to spend the last 3 years of her life here in my home with my mother. And I saw how hard my mom worked to take care of her mom. And it was really beautiful. And so I hope to be able to pay that forward and show the same generosity to my elders. And if you're asking me, then what thing do I want to do in the future is more of that, like not just my elders, but not just my biological elders, right? But who are my spiritual elders and my community elders, and how can we make sure that they have what they need? Because us younger folks, we have the agency a lot of times and the resources that we can share and spread to those that need it. So that's what I am looking for ways to incorporate more of moving forward.
That's awesome. That's a new one. I haven't got that one before.
Right on.
But thanks very much. I appreciate you taking your time. I know it's very valuable. Those are like plenty of threads you could have like sewn up.
But you know what? The other hat I wear, I don't know how many hats I wear in this conversation, but I also am a storyteller, if you haven't noticed. So I enjoy the opportunity to tell my stories.
You do it well, sir.
Thank you. And thank y'all for listening. I appreciate it.
And I'll put all those links up for his book and maybe just your link tree to help out too. I saw that up there. I was like, that's probably one of the easiest things to put up there.
All in one place.
Well, thank you. Have a good night.
You too. My pleasure.
If you like this week's episode of People More Interesting Than Me, please follow me on Apple Podcasts so you won't miss out on more episodes like these.